This happened about 7 years ago on a business trip. I stayed in Ikebukuro, in a well-known hotel. There is something I want to mention about me. I feel as if I have a sixth sense sometimes. By that, I feel as if I'm aware of otherworldly presences when I encounter them. I wouldn't say that this sixth sense of mine is particularly strong, but it is there, and I want to share an experience that happened when I stayed in that hotel in Ikebukuro. The room I stayed in was room 913. I was just staying for one night in a double bed. A senior co-worker at my company was staying in the room next door. From the moment I opened the door to room 913, I felt something strange. I had this weird feeling that I hadn't ever had before. It was, and still is, an indescribable feeling. Because that feeling was so unusual, I didn't know what to think about it, so I figured that it was just my imagination, but now I can see it was an early warning sign I was picking up on. A red flag. It was night, and darkness fell on the hotel quickly, as it was February. I thought that the best thing I could do for work the following morning was to go ahead and get an early night's sleep. I drifted off to sleep that night with ease. I didn't stay asleep for very long though. I woke up to the sound of someone barging into my hotel room. I could tell it was a man almost instantly. It was like I knew without even seeing it. I could also tell that I was still asleep. This was the beginning of some kind of nightmare. My brain was fully functioning, but my body was glued to the bed. It was like I was watching what was happening, as if it was a movie. The man who was in my room wasn't a native Japanese person like me. I was sleeping on my side, with my back facing the door he had just came in. The man slowly wandered around my dark hotel room a bit, and then he walked around the bed to face me. He stared right into my face. He looked so angry and rage-filled. Then suddenly his hands shot to my neck, and he began applying lots of pressure. I was so scared of how much he seemed to hate me and want to hurt me. I felt myself choking and losing oxygen. I really started to panic. And then, suddenly I woke up, and I was alone in my hotel room. I was so freaked out by what had just happened that I wanted to call my coworker. I wanted to speak to someone. I couldn't though. I didn't leave my phone by the bedside table. I left it on charge on the desk. And there was a mirror on that desk, and there was no way in hell that I was going to look into that past midnight. Hi, Jay here. Mirrors are a very prominent item in Japanese horror. I think I could do a whole video on them one day. In this case, I believe that the reason the writer doesn't want to go anywhere near the mirror after that nightmare was down to the belief that for some Japanese people, if you look at yourself in the mirror after midnight, then you might just see something else, something horrifying, or something ghostly, as mirrors can be portals and pathways into different worlds. Back to the story. I stayed awake until the early morning light spilled into the room, and only at that point I felt confident enough to shut my eyes for a few moments. My colleague came to my hotel room so we could head downstairs for breakfast together. After checking, it was him out there through the peephole. He then cried out in shock when he saw me. He could see that something was wrong. At breakfast, I talked to him about what had happened the night before. The worst thing about our situation was the fact that we were staying at that hotel for another few nights. After work that day, I called a friend of a friend who was into the occult and the supernatural, and I asked him for some advice. He told me how to deal with what I experienced, and I followed his instructions. Although it had done nothing to improve the atmosphere, what he got me to do managed to at least calm me down. Just after midnight, I heard a loud bang coming from the wall that separated my room from my colleague's. It scared the hell out of me. It sounded like a real powerful bang. After I gave it some thought, I guessed that it could have been my colleague pranking me. With that in mind, I managed to get some sleep. In the morning, I saw my colleague again for breakfast, and I said to him, "Oh, by the way, great prank last night, banging the wall like that, thanks a lot." He said he didn't know what I was talking about. And To be honest, I'm pretty sure he was telling the truth about that. It scared me to think that I might have been close to experiencing another paranormal onslaught, but thankfully nothing else happened that night, and for the rest of the trip. I could still remember the face of the man who strangled me. I look for that face in the crowds of Tokyo. I don't think I'll ever see him, but if I did, I think I'd have a heart attack. I wonder if that was just my brain that conjured up that man attacking me, or if something like that happened in that hotel in Ikebukuro, in room 913. Last Wednesday, I decided to go fishing at the local sea. My hometown was deeply affected by 311, the Great East Japan earthquake, and the subsequent tsunami, which claimed many lives. Despite the tragedy, life here has continued, and the coastal area, lined with large factories like paper mills, plywood factories, fisheries, and ice factories, has become a regular fishing spot for locals. These factories, with their bright lights, attract plankton and small fish, which in turn attract larger fish. This makes it a great spot for anglers. However, on that particular Wednesday, it suddenly got cold out, and being a weekday, I somehow found myself alone at the usually crowded spot. I started fishing at about 6 p.m, and by 7 p.m, darkness had completely set in. It was great being out there alone. I was able to catch more fish than usual. Typically I would pack up by 8 p.m. or so. But since I had the place to myself, I decided to stay a bit longer, eventually planning to leave around 9 p.m. As I stood there casting my line into the dark waters, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I just loved the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore, and the occasional splish, splash of a fish breaking the surface. The stars in the sky's reflections were dancing on the water's surface. It was a perfect night for fishing, and I was glad I had decided to stay longer. At one point, I decided to move to a new spot, so I got up and I walked about 200 meters. That's when I noticed a strange smell. Incense mixed with the sweet scent of flowers. This was unusual because the area usually carried the scent of wood from the nearby factories. The incense smell was strong, almost overpowering the usual woody aroma. I remember something that I read online about a month ago. If you smell incense, a spirit is nearby. This thought unnerved me, so I quickly headed back to my original spot. I felt relieved to be smelling that familiar smell of wood again, and after a minute or two, I relaxed and got back to fishing. Despite that scare, I was soon engrossed in the thrill of catching fish after fish. I had never had such luck before, and I felt a surge of excitement with each catch. The fish were biting, and I wondered if the change in the weather had something to do with it. My hands were getting cold, but I didn't mind. The thrill of the catch kept me warm. About 15 minutes went by, and then I suddenly heard a car horn somewhere in the distance. This kind of snapped me back to reality, and I realized that it was probably time to head home. Although I hadn't smelled the incense since moving, I didn't really feel like taking any chances being alone out there any later than I was. I quickly packed up my fishing gear and made my way back to my car. As I loaded my equipment into the car and I got into the driver's seat, I caught a whiff of that same incense smell mixed with the sweet scent of flowers. I froze in place. It was really creepy to smell that in my car in the middle of the night, but I needed to stay logical, so I tried to ignore it. But it was unmistakable. Even now, a week later, I still catch that scent at night. It must be lingering in the car. It really freaks me out and kind of makes me feel as if something near the coast of the sea has followed me back home. I try not to drive at night because I don't really want to smell that smell again. Every time I smell it, it reminds me of that strange night by the sea, where I thought I was fishing alone. Hi, Jay here. Incense is often used in Japanese funeral services, and when you visit Japan, it's not uncommon to light an incense stick before a portrait of a family member to pay your respects when visiting a family home. I've done this. A few years ago, I used to travel around Japan taking photos. I was really into photography. I was particularly interested in taking shots of abandoned buildings. I found a service area along a highway that looked to me as if it had been abandoned. I mean, there was no doubt that the building was at very least closed. It was boarded up, and it looked to me like it had been closed for years. Everything on the outside was weather-worn. No one was taking care of it. So that's when I saw my opportunity. I remember it being a very foggy day. There was poor visibility on the roads, which actually helped my case if I wanted to sneak in and out without anyone calling the cops or the cops finding me themselves. I pulled into the service area and got out of my car to take some photos of the exterior of the building. I loved the way it was swathed in fog. This was out along mountain roads, by the way, so the fog was even more impressive as I was quite high up. I guess it could be called mist if it's mountains, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. After I finished taking some photos of the outside, I managed to gain access through a broken window. The service area was 2 stories high. I imagine that the first floor might have been used for drinks and snacks, and the top floor might have been used for restaurants and public toilets. Since I was on the first floor, I took some photos down there. After a while, I started to notice that there was sounds coming from upstairs on the second floor. Occasionally, I have encountered homeless people living in abandoned buildings, so I wondered if this was the case. Other times, it's gangs of youths in the abandoned buildings smashing up the place and doing God knows what. I was afraid that someone dangerous could be in there with me, so I called out, "Hello? Is anybody up there?" I waited in silence in the dark, abandoned service area. I couldn't hear any more noises coming from the second floor for a little while. But then after about 30 seconds passed, I heard the sound of someone dragging something while walking around up there. Well, at least that's what it sounded like to me. The noises from above echoed all around. The acoustics were incredible in there. I felt my brow get a little sweaty now. The picture, as I saw it, was one of a person refusing to respond and making me aware of their presence. But of course, I wondered if whoever was up there heard me or not. Maybe I wasn't loud enough, so I walked over to the foot of the stairs, crunching on broken glass. As I went, and I shouted, "Hello, is anyone up there? I'm just taking a couple of photos. I mean you no harm. Do you mind if I come up there and take a couple of photos on the second floor? I won't be long, and as soon as I'm done, I'll head out." I heard my own voice reverberate through the service area, and I knew that I had been loud enough this time. I waited on bated breath for a reply from the second floor. I was expecting a voice, but that wasn't the type of reply that I got. It sounded to me like someone started hitting something very heavy on the ground, like a metal bat or something. It did this slow and steady, intimidating banging sound on something metallic. It went bang, 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 bang. "Sorry," I called out. I was panicked and I didn't really know what to do, in all honesty. As soon as I called out, the banging sound got more aggressive and quicker. It was as if the aggressive banging said, "Hurry up and get out." One thing I noticed, though, was the fact that the banging sounded as if it was getting closer to the top of the stairs. Where I had heard it coming from was somewhere near the back of the top floor, but now it was coming to the front. The banging sound was so loud that I could feel the vibrations shaking down the stairs as it approached. I didn't stick around to find out what it was though. I took off running as fast as I could, and I literally leapt through the broken window I had carefully climbed in through. I ran to my car without looking back, and it was only when I started my engine that I noticed that my palm was bleeding. I must have cut it getting through the window. My steering wheel was covered in my own blood, but I didn't let that slow me down. I wanted to get away. I don't really know what was up there. I looked it up on the internet to see if there was any kind of blog postings about the place, and I was able to find a couple of ghost hunter blogs about the service area. They claim to have heard voices and banging sounds coming from the second floor. I can attest to that for sure, but one thing I'm a little cautious over doing is attributing the noises that I heard that evening to the paranormal. The blogs I read all seemed to believe that there was some kind of paranormal activity going on up there, but I feel like I experienced something else. I can't quite put my finger on it. Was it a person? A prank? Or was it, as they say online, some kind of evil entity? Perhaps something demonic or some kind of trickster spirit. Something that has made that rundown service area its home. I'm really not sure, but it was pretty scary, whatever it was. This happened when I was working in a convenience store near a cram school. I used to work late at night, and I was known as a bit of a senior since I had more experience than the university students who worked part-time. It was a great place to work, to be honest, and I have some good memories working there. But this experience tops the list. It's not exactly a fond memory for me, but it is something I'll never forget. Our convenience store didn't get all that busy at night time, so me and the other staff members found ourselves pretty free most of the nights. We used to hang out in the back and eat and read the magazines. It was great. One night while we were doing our usual thing of hanging out at the back, I was on shift with a junior and I was checking the security cameras. I liked this guy. He was nice, and we had a good back and forth. We used to argue about movies and stuff. It was fun. The monitor in the back room is split up into 4 sections. 2 parts of the screen show the 2 cash registers, and the other 2 parts of the screen show portions of the aisles in the magazine rack. When I looked at the screen, I saw that there was a woman stood by the magazine rack. Nothing wrong with that, right? Customers come in and out all the time. However, it was different for her. Neither of us heard the entrance chime when she came in. Just for context, she had long, dark hair, and it looked kind of messy. My colleague noticed her too, and said, "Hey, I didn't hear the chime." To be honest, there have been occasions where the chime didn't ring in the past, so we just carried on talking without giving it much thought. What we usually did was come out of the back when the customer approached the register. After a while, I noticed that she wasn't moving. She just stood there like a statue. She didn't even pick up a magazine. She just stood there staring into space. My colleague said to me, "Is she planning on shoplifting?" It hadn't occurred to me, but I thought it could be a possibility. It was pretty odd that she hadn't moved. We had an idea. We were going to go out and check on her. We would go in a pincher movement, coming at her from either side, and we would make like we were stocking the shelves or dusting them. We walked right up to the magazine rack, but then we stopped, because she was gone. So we headed back to the back room thinking, oh well, whatever. When we got back to the staff room, I looked at the monitor again, and I was completely shocked to see the same woman stood back at the magazine rack. That's too fast, surely. How the hell did she do that? Was the monitor malfunctioning? We spoke about it amongst ourselves, and we decided to go out there again and check. So we headed out in the same pincher movement, just as before, towards the magazine rack, and once again she wasn't there. How was she doing this? We rushed back to the staff room and I for one was absolutely chilled by what was going on. I felt cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't explain what was happening. Then we were quiet. The first thing my colleague did was check the monitor, and he told me that once again, the woman with the dark hair was gone. I was feeling relieved, and I think he must have been feeling the same. But something weird was going on for sure. I wanted to see the monitors for myself, so I leaned over my colleague's shoulder to get a closer look. "Hey, wait, don't move," he said. I just listened to him, and I froze in place. He sounded scared. I stayed next to him thinking, what the hell is this? "Just listen to me. Don't turn around." I was worried. Was he all right? But then I looked at the reflection on the monitor, not the live feed of the monitor, but the reflection on the glass, and everything became clear. I could see our faces, but there was something else. Just behind us was a figure, and I knew who it was. I could see the face of the woman we had seen earlier for the first time. I held back a scream, and I felt my back go completely stiff. We were frozen in place, watching that reflection for about 1 minute straight, until suddenly she drifted off towards the left. We stayed there for another minute, too scared to move. I tried to calm myself down, until I couldn't bear it anymore. I had to look. I slowly turned around in fear, only to find no one there. We both just backed away from the monitor in stunned silence. "Something's going on here," my colleague said, as if he wanted me to agree that he wasn't going mad. He was looking at me with these pleading eyes. I looked away from him and said, "Yeah, I agree." By the time I looked back, he was completely fixated on the monitors again, and I felt my heart sink in my chest. What the hell was going to happen next? I looked at the screen, and that woman was back. She was stood out there by the magazine rack again. She turned to face the camera and smiled, and then slowly opened her mouth. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen, especially on blurry pixels. Without saying anything, my colleague ran out of the back door, leaving me alone in the store. As much as I wanted to run out right behind him, I couldn't. I had a responsibility as the senior staff member. I spent the remainder of the shift stood out front by the register. I figured that if I didn't look at the monitors, then I wouldn't see that woman. And I was right. That was the first and last time I ever saw that woman. I was pissed at my colleague, but he apologized. It was the weirdest and scariest experience I have ever had, and I don't think I'll ever be able to explain what happened that night. I saw a thread a little while ago. I think that the title of it was something like, "Has anyone seen a shadow person?" I've never really believed in things like that, but recently I have turned from a skeptic to a believer. I want to share my experience here. You may laugh at me, or you may just feel as if you've seen something similar. The thing I read about said that these shadow beings, if you ever see them, aren't really that harmful. I don't know if that's true or not, since I have read some other experiences where they do seem to be harmful. The shadow thing that I saw, I'm not sure if I would call that thing friendly. Let me tell you about it. It happened when I was stood waiting in line to board an incoming train. I was leaving a friend's place. A friend of mine had moved, and I wanted to stop by and wish them well. I was absent-mindedly gazing towards the tracks, and then something caught my eye. There was a person. Well, not quite a person. Something human-shaped. It just appeared on the tracks. It was raining out, but it wasn't affecting my vision. I had to blink to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I couldn't really tell if it was a man or a woman at that point. It was just a shadow. This is going to sound completely strange, but it looked kind of like a television searching for channels, but darker. You know, static. It looked like a shadow made of static, but it was mainly shadowy. One thing I noticed almost instantly about that figure on the tracks was the fact that it was missing a part of its left leg, just below the knee. Although I couldn't really make out any facial features of this thing, I could tell that the head had a strange shape to it. The word concave came to mind pretty quickly. It was sort of hollowed inward. This probably sounds like the ramblings of a madman, but in those brief seconds that I saw that thing, I didn't have time to fully process or question it, I guess. It raised a hand to its face as if to study it, to feel the texture. And then something clicked in my head. It was on the train tracks, and there was a train pulling in soon. Despite how it appeared, it still looked human-like enough to make me worry for it. I was shocked that no one else around had reacted. Not one person in the line for the train seemed to react to what was unfolding. A tinny announcement rang out along the station platform. We were all told that the train was approaching. I thought, oh my, if no one helps, then if there is a person on the tracks and my eyes are just playing tricks on me, then they're about to be mowed down. I began to panic. I don't think anyone else around me even batted an eye. They were staring down at their phones or talking with their friends. I heard the squeeze of brakes as the oncoming train approached, and naturally, I recoiled in horror. I didn't want to see what I thought was inevitable. I clasped my hands to my ears, expecting to hear screams and shouts, but I heard nothing of the sort. I honestly thought that I was going mad at that point. I decided to take a look back towards the tracks. I saw that shadowy person there. It was still there on the tracks. I was about to get on the train. I wanted to be away from that area, and I couldn't believe what I saw next. From the position I was about to board the train, I could see its weird, concaved face peering up at me. It was as if it ignored the fact a train was on top of it, or even had ran into it. Even though it had no features on its face, I felt as if it was looking at me from the position it was stood on the tracks. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no nothing, but I know it was seeing. I felt strongly that it saw me, and I really hate that. The next thing I felt was a prod in my back, and a voice said, "Miss, can you get out of the way? There are people who actually want to board the train." A member of the public had noticed that I had been holding up the line. I didn't realize until the moment that I had been disturbed that I had been holding up the line. I didn't really know what else to do other than apologize and move aside. I didn't feel as if I could get on board without completely losing my mind. I backed off the train, causing a bit of a scene, I might add. I watched the train leave, and I saw that shadow thing was now on board the train with the other commuters. It loomed over a passenger, stood by the door. It was studying her. And I don't know what to think anymore. I have to say, though, I am worried about the passenger I saw. I'm kind of worried about myself, too. Are these shadow things real, or am I losing it? This experience I'm about to share with you happened to my wife and I when we were in our 20s. It was a vivid, confusing, and terrifying experience that we haven't really wanted to share with friends and family through fear of being laughed at and misunderstood. Over the years, my wife and I have always kind of wondered if anyone out there has seen what we have seen. I'm staying anon either way. It happened in August of 1990, and back during that summer, my wife and I were working part-time jobs. We had a carefree lifestyle compared to our current one. We were focused on saving money and putting it into savings for traveling. We traveled to Kansai on the day in question, and we were taking in the famous sights. It was something that we had always been looking forward to. We booked a nice inn for the night, and when the sun went down, we made tracks. We arrived and checked into the inn, and we were very pleased to be staying there that night. There was a really nice grove of trees outside, and our room was on the east side of the building. I was glad to have a room that would seemingly be shaded by the trees come the morning. It was the height of summer after all. We chatted for a while, took a bath, changed into yukata robes, and had dinner, and then we put the TV on. It was a really relaxing evening after a long day of walking around. As the night drew in on the first night of our trip, we decided to confirm our love for one another without hesitation. Just before that, I shut off the TV and the room went dark, but not too dark. I then opened a window and pulled across the bug screen. It was a hot night. Everything had been so great. It was the perfect beginning to our trip. Afterwards, we lay there in bed talking. We talked for a while about what we wanted to do the next day, etc. But then my wife fell silent. I had been staring at the ceiling, waiting for her to reply, but I decided to look over to her. I guessed that she had fallen asleep. I turned and saw that she was staring at something, and then she whispered, "Outside. The window." The window was just behind me, and my wife's eyes were glued to it. I looked at the TV screen. It was on the other side of the room, on my wife's side. The moon was out that night, and there was something out there. I saw it reflected on the TV. I held my breath, and my wife seemingly tried to disappear beneath the covers, even though it was so hot. I felt sweat dripping down my forehead. It wasn't sweat from the heat, it was sweat from fear, I think. Something was right outside the screen window. I felt paralyzed, like a frog staring at a snake. I felt like I was unable to move, but then I saw the fear on my wife's face. She had a cat-like focus on the window, and that was the point where I felt like something needed to give. I couldn't take lying there doing nothing anymore. I turned on my side and I looked towards the window, and I saw something huge out there. At first, it looked to me like it was a giant, rocky structure, covered in thick green moss. But that wasn't right, it just couldn't be possible. My eyes adjusted when I focused on it, and a face emerged from within the greenish rock. A face that had harsh, glaring eyes. Eyes that were emotionless. They reminded me of a shark's. Its face was like an ogre's, and that rocky greenish surface looked like it had just emerged from a mountain. It looked like a living mountain. Its eyes and the mouth structure looked demonic, like an oni. Hi, Jay here. Oni are evil spirits from Japanese mythology and folklore. If you look at the screen now, you can see some depictions of some. Oni are typically large in size, possess superhuman strength, and are horrifying in appearance. They're also associated with disease, calamity, and misfortune. Oni are found in countless Japanese stories and myths, where they tend to be portrayed as villains with a well-known appetite for murder and cannibalism. Back to the story. It looked like there was a huge green demonic-looking creature stood outside the window. I started praying internally, praying for help from my ancestors to protect me against what I perceived to be an inherent threat. We were locked in a standstill situation. We were too scared to move, my wife and I. I was personally frightened, that if I moved even my little finger, that huge hulking creature would notice and smash its way into our hotel room. We could hear its heavy, labored breath as it breathed in and out. It watched us for what felt like hours. The standoff felt never-ending. If I had to guess, then I would say we stayed staring at that thing for close to an hour, if not longer. Then, it took a few thunderous steps backwards. I thought it was going to leave, but it didn't. It just stood at a distance and watched for a little longer. And then, finally, it disappeared into the woods. I could hear branches snapping and trees swaying as it moved further away. My throat was incredibly dry, but I was scared to move. I couldn't even bring myself to get up and close the window. I couldn't sleep. As soon as the first light of morning came, I got up and drank more water than I've ever drank in my life. And then I looked out of the window, and I saw an endless forest, which led into the towering mountains. I shuddered. I started packing up our things right then and there. I wanted nothing more than to head home. In the coming days, weeks and months, my wife and I suffered with some lasting effects from seeing that creature. I personally suffered with insomnia, and when I could sleep, the nightmares, they were hellish. I would wake up with a fever, feeling bedridden at times. We're doing much better now, but we both don't really want to speak about that encounter to one another. You know, people always say that they want to have a frightening experience or see something creepy, so I guess if you are one of those people, build a good relationship up with God and start praying to spirits and your ancestors, because you're going to need something, I guess. I think if it wasn't through the power of praying for someone or something to protect me, then my wife and I would have featured on a missing person report. I can still see those dark, shark-like eyes when I close my eyes. Please be careful out there. This happened when I was working part-time at a ramen restaurant. I first got that job when I was around 16 years old, during my early years as a high school student. This happened in my hometown, Kota, in Shiga Prefecture. The ramen restaurant that I worked in was inside a shopping department. I worked nearly every weekday after school serving customers and operating the register. I would start at about 7 and work right up to midnight on some nights, cleaning and closing down usually. Opposite the register there was a row of seats for anyone in the mall to use who needed to have a break. They were used by everyone, not just customers of our restaurant. My experience happened about a year and a half into working there, making me a 17-year-old. Also, I'm a female. On one of my shifts, my manager and my coworker both approached me during a lull in the shift and asked me the following. "Hey, Erica, do you have any older friends around here?" Of course, I was a bit confused by their question, but I quickly responded with, "No." I didn't want to be asked their weird questions like that. My manager and my coworker were both kind of shocked, and they shook their heads in what, disagreement or surprise? I wasn't sure at the time, and then my manager said, "I see." I didn't know why they asked me such a question. I didn't know what they were talking about. I got back to work and I kind of shook it off. A few weeks went by and my coworker came up to me again and said, "Hey Erica, can you please go to the bathroom and come back?" Okay, this was weird. I stood there confused, and then the manager came over. I asked both of them why, but neither of them gave me a proper answer. The manager just replied with, "It's fine, it's just an experiment. Could you please go back and forth real quick?" I did as I was asked, and I went back and forth from them and the bathroom. I didn't understand what the point of this so-called experiment would be though. After going to the bathroom, standing there for a couple of seconds and coming back, I saw looks of concern over my coworker and manager's faces. My manager then frowned and said, "I think you might be being followed by an older man." I couldn't really understand what they meant. I guess that was because I was young and a little naive. I couldn't really process what older man would have any interest in following me and why, so I asked them. The pair of them then made a subtle glance across to the row of seats, and then I looked in that direction. I saw an older man sat there on the seats, looking our way, but as soon as he saw me looking in his direction, he turned his head. I had no idea who that guy was. I felt a little creeped out by him though. He was certainly looking my way. I asked my coworkers why they thought he was following me. I mean, sitting outside of the restaurant. Is that being followed? I didn't know the rules, so I let them explain. Every time you're on shift, that guy sits right over there and he looks at you. When you leave work, or get up and go to the restaurant, he gets up too, and he starts following you. It seems to us like he's stalking. It scared the heck out of me. Not like a ghost story or horror film did though. As they say, people are way scarier. I looked over at him again. I wanted to make sure that I was sure that I didn't know him. I studied his face, and I was certain that to me he was a stranger. I felt really weird inside when I realized that. Kind of disgusted, or just kind of numb and cold. After they told me that he had been watching me, I couldn't get it out of my mind while I worked. I spent my shift either looking over my shoulder or looking straight at him. I would make casual glances in an attempt not to make eye contact with him. When I left for home that night, the guys made sure they walked with me part of the way. But later when I was alone, I looked over my shoulder and I saw that creepy middle-aged guy following me from a distance. I realized in that moment that I was being stalked. I got home, but my God, it was nervy. I didn't know if that guy just happened to walk home the same way that I went. I only realized a little later that I couldn't really just go on what my coworkers' theories were. I mean, they were hardly detectives. I didn't really want to, but I just had to give the man who gave me the creeps the benefit of the doubt. However, my thoughts changed when I went back to work the following night because the creepy man was back. It was more than a coincidence. I went to the bathroom and I noticed that he was stood kind of close to the bathroom while I was in there. Then later on my break, I needed to go to a nearby convenience store. When I left, I realized that he was following on behind me. He watched me go in, and then to my surprise, he left, thinking positively. I was kind of glad of being away from that guy, so I headed back to the restaurant. I saw a familiar figure sat on the seats opposite my work though. He watched me return to the store. He never took his eyes off me. I asked my coworkers and manager to keep an eye out for that creep. Over the coming days, I was still unaware of what I should do. Chillingly, I heard from one of my colleagues that my new stalker was seen going into the same convenience store as me right after I had left, and apparently he bought the exact same things as me. He was taking an interest in all the magazines I had picked up and flipped through. It was all piling up on me. It felt like he was there from the moment I started my shift until the moment I finished it. I didn't know what I could accuse him of though, and how much trouble it would bring me if I did accuse him and it wasn't taken seriously. I was so creeped out by him, at that point I began to resent going to work, to the job that I really enjoyed. I was beginning to feel frightened, more and more regularly. My manager, I guess, picked up on how anxious that man made me, and he went to the security guard with a complaint about him. The security guard went over to the creepy guy and made a big scene and embarrassed him, and then moved him on. It wasn't anything like, "Hey, you creep." It was something more subtle, like, "Excuse me, can you explain what you're doing?" It worked, and it worked fast because in a matter of moments he was gone. He quick walked away from the row of seats while his face turned red. I was relieved, but my relief was short-lived because the very next day, that man was back, and he was up to his old tricks. He was watching me and following me again. My manager was really angry that that man was back, and he stormed straight over to the security guard of our department store and told him to give the creepy guy a strong message. He's not to return, and if he tries to come back, then we will be filing a police report. The security guard went right on over to the creep who was sat on the seats opposite our restaurant, and he gave him that warning. Once again, creepy guy got up and stormed out as if he had been embarrassed. I hoped he would learn the second time around. I guessed that the threat of the police report might have done the job. We all felt confident that the weirdo wouldn't be back again, and for the first time in a long while, it was quite an enjoyable shift for me. I was able to work with peace of mind until closing time. I can't tell you how nice it was to glance up from the register and see nothing but vacant seats opposite me. With everything closed down for the evening, it was time to head home, and little did I know, but my journey home that night was going to be quite memorable. I headed to the underground parking lot to get my bicycle. It was always dark down there, especially when I got off the late night shift. I unlocked my bike and I hopped on. I went to push off to get going, but for some reason my bike didn't move. I tried to push off again and nothing happened. I didn't know what was wrong with my bike. I really didn't need this on top of all that was going on at work. I turned to see if my back wheel was caught on something, and that was the moment I faced my stalker eye to eye. He was stood there with both hands wrapped tightly around my back tire. He was preventing me from leaving. It was terrifying because it seemed as if he literally had stepped out of the shadows. I had no idea that he was in the underground parking lot with me. I was so scared that I couldn't make a sound. I tried to push off again, but it was a bit weaker this time. And I tried to scream, but nothing would come out. Nothing would work. It was at that point that I realized he was muttering something. He was saying, "Why? Why? Why?" Something like that. I don't know why, but something just kind of changed in me at that point, like a switch that needed to be flipped. I exchanged my fear for anger in a matter of seconds. I turned around and I yelled at him, "What do you think you're doing? Let go of my bike." I didn't expect him to come back at me with the following: "Why? Why did you say that you were going to the police? What on earth are you thinking?" His words really creeped me out, like beyond how he had been behaving up until that point. I think it was because they were just so one-sided. It was all about him, and not the trouble he had been causing me. "Look, I'm scared. You creep me out. Please let go of me." I said that next. Well, maybe shouted is more accurate. I knew that embarrassment seemed to work on this guy, so I tried to make him feel embarrassed. He came back at me with a louder voice, shouting at me. "I never put my hands on you. Are you kidding me? You're gonna call the cops just because I looked at you? Well, good luck." Again, this did nothing but highlight how selfish and horrible this guy was. He didn't care how he was affecting me. He was just interested in himself. Fortunately, our heated exchange of words had alerted the mall security guard to come rushing over. As soon as that creep noticed that security was coming his way, he bolted. He ran off with his tail tucked between his legs. After that encounter, my boss demanded police patrols to make sure that if that guy showed up again, he would be met with the police. Even though cops were walking about the mall, I couldn't help but think that he would show up at any moment while I was working. I began to get super anxious when anyone would look my way for more than a second or two. I was growing more and more paranoid by the day. I had to leave that job in the end. I got into a university hundreds of miles away. I'm glad I left, to be honest. But before that creep came along, even though the hours sucked some nights, that was probably one of the best jobs I ever had. One thing I still have trouble getting over all these years is the fact that he was angry at me for wanting to report his disgusting behavior. I saw a glimpse of his solipsistic world, a man with no ethics or empathy, a man who said this to a 17-year-old female who was scared and tired of being stalked by him. He said, "I never put my hands on you. Are you kidding me? Are you going to go to the cops all because I looked at you? Good luck." He knew what he was doing. He knew when to leave when security came. He knew he had to hide when the police presence was in the mall, and he knew how to try to gaslight and to try to manipulate me into believing that I was going to be in the wrong for reporting him. All I could say is that I'm very grateful for all the dudes that helped me through that issue. If it wasn't for those guys, then I don't know. This happened when I was in my last year of high school. It was a dark night, and I was up in my bed sleeping, with my back facing the wall on my right side. I was sleeping soundly, to the best of my recollection, until I was suddenly woken up by something. It was a very strange situation for me because my eyes didn't open slowly like they do in the morning. You know, you take a moment sometimes to wake up in the mornings, right? You rub the sleep out of your eye, maybe have a little stretch. Well, none of that happened. I opened my eyes and I was fully awake. As soon as I opened my eyes, I saw a face staring back at me. It was like there was someone with me in the bed, sleeping side by side, like we were sleeping in the bed together. Although the face had some distinct features, I was unable to make out the gender. The only thing that came through was the emotion on that face. It looked angry and desperate, like it was pleading for something. It was horrifying. I mean, this is all what I ascertained in a matter of seconds. I couldn't bring myself to look for long. I didn't even look below the face at the body. But even though I saw it, very, very briefly, it's burned into my memories forever. I don't know why I didn't freak out more than I did. I guess because it was so sudden. On one level, I might have thought of it as a nightmare or something. I was scared, so I reacted by muscle memory. I naturally turned away from it, and onto my other side. I noticed my alarm clock as I turned. It was just after 1 a.m. As soon as I turned on my side, it was like a lock was set. I was stuck. I couldn't move a muscle. It was the first time in my life that something like that happened. I guessed that it was sleep paralysis. I couldn't even make a sound. Moreover, from the moment that I rolled over on my other side, it was like my eyelids went down and closed permanently. I tried my best to open them, but I just couldn't. I was wide awake, but without the use of my eyes, and all I could think of was the fact that there was someone sleeping in the bed, right behind me. In my mind, it was very clear that I wasn't alone, and it was really frightening. My body was rigid, like a dead weight. Then I suddenly felt a cold chill at the nape of my neck. It was a rhythmic blow, and then I realized that it resembled someone breathing in and breathing out. The air I felt on my neck was cold. It was horrifying. I also felt eyes boring into the back of my head, eyes that stared without blink or break, eyes that were solely focused on watching me. It was a disgusting feeling. Just picture falling asleep alone in bed and then seeing something, turning away from it, and then being physically locked in, unable to get away from it, and its breath that you feel on your neck. If you're freaked out by the thought of that, then you might understand why I felt like I was on the verge of panic. Just when I thought I couldn't be more terrified, I heard something that made me feel like my heart was being gripped by an ice-cold hand. I heard a voice mutter, "Mama? Mama? Mama?" It was not a female voice nor a male's. I'm not even sure if I heard it out loud. The voice seemed to come from a place that I couldn't pinpoint. It's so hard to describe. It was almost as if it came from the ground or the walls. It was there, but not really there. Perhaps I heard it inside my mind. It seemed to reverberate directly inside my head. I was beyond scared. No adjectives could do justice to how I felt in those moments. The only thought, beside that voice that was the loudest in my mind, was the thought to run. I wanted to run away and never come back home. I couldn't help think of how my parents were sleeping soundly, only a few meters away, and I couldn't call out to them for help. This prompted an effort to try and move a part of my body. I wanted to make something happen. A twitch of a finger, a squeak from my throat, a shudder, an itch, anything. I wanted to feel something other than fear. I couldn't do anything though. no matter how hard I tried. I just focused on using all the strength I had in my body, but nothing happened. For reference, if you want to imagine what I did, try tensing every muscle in your body and screwing your hands and feet as best you can into balls. That's what I did. I couldn't bear that cold breath on my neck, so I kept trying to tense up. And when I felt movement in the bed shuffle closer to me, I lost it. I don't know what happened. I think my mind couldn't handle any more than I was taking already. After that, I woke up lying on the floor in the same position I was sleeping in, on the bed. It felt as if I had been laying there for hours. I naturally tried to move my body, and thankfully I could at that point. I raced to my feet and looked at my alarm clock. I was amazed to see that only a few minutes had passed since the time I looked at my clock last. I ran over to the light switch and turned it on. I felt a lot better with the light on. I struggle with the idea that this was all a nightmare, because that voice that I heard and the breath that I felt on the back of my neck seemed all too real. It was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. Just as a side note that I feel is worth mentioning, I brought our family dog into the bedroom as soon as this was all over, and my dog did something very interesting. He kept barking at a corner of the ceiling, and as you might expect, that scared the living daylights out of me. It was like the presence I felt was still in the room, only this time I couldn't see where it was. I did something that I thought would help. I went over to the corner and tried to enter into conversation with whatever was in my room, some kind of entity. I asked for it not to appear again, and for some reason I felt the need to apologize, and when I did that, the tears started flowing down my cheeks. I guess one other thing that I feel like might be worth mentioning is the fact that before I was born, my mother had a stillborn. I was supposed to have a brother. There may be some connection due to that, but I'm not sure. Maybe I had a visit from a brother I didn't get a chance to meet. Or maybe I'm just trying to find reason or rationality to help me get over what happened. Nothing has really happened since that night, and although some of you reading this might find it bizarre, I'm still currently living and sleeping in that very same bedroom. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from my friend, Yoichi. It was so out of character for him that I almost thought that he pocket dialed me. Yoichi isn't the kind of guy to reach out. He's more of the quiet type, someone who prefers to keep himself to himself. We'd been friends for a while, but even though we got along quite well, he rarely reached out. It wasn't that he didn't care, he just didn't like bothering people. And I guess deep down, he didn't like being bothered either. When I answered the phone, I was surprised to hear how tired he sounded. Yo-chan, what's up? You sound exhausted. There was a brief pause before he chuckled. But this wasn't his usual laugh. It was thin, almost forced.
Yeah, I guess I'm having a hard time lately. I'm so tired. Maybe I'm getting old, you know.
I couldn't help but laugh at that. What are you talking about? We're both still in our 20s. We're far from old. I mean, he was in the opposite end of his 20s from me, but I couldn't believe that he was making out like he was an old man. Yoichi and I worked at the same convenience store. He worked the night shift. It wasn't the most exciting job, but the pay was decent, especially since he worked the graveyard shift. Over time, he fully adapted to the lifestyle that the night shift demanded. It suited him in a way, given how he preferred to be left alone. The quiet hours of the night meant fewer customers and more time alone with his thoughts. But something about the way he sounded on the phone made me think that this time, the isolation was getting to him. Did something happen at work? I asked, my tone a little bit more serious now. There was a pause, longer this time.
Yeah, Kinda. Can we meet up?
The hesitation in his voice made me worry. Yoichi wasn't one to ask for help lightly, so whatever was bothering him had to be serious. We agreed on a day to meet up, and after he hung up, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest. I was thinking, did he get into substances or something? Those night shifts can be tiring. Maybe he needed something to stay awake. Then I wondered if he had gotten into debt, and there were debt collectors at our store pressuring him for money. Whatever it was didn't seem like it was going to be good news. Little did I know, when I met up with him, I would hear a story that would chill me to my core. On the day that we were supposed to meet, I made my way over to Yoichi's apartment. I'd been there a few times before, and it always struck me how neat and organized everything was. His place was spotless, almost too neat for a guy living on his own. He was meticulous, almost to the point of being obsessive about cleanliness. It didn't seem to match his personality well, at least the side of him that I experienced at work. When I walked in, I immediately felt a strange tension in the air. It was subtle, like a faint buzzing that you couldn't quite place. "Hey, I'm sensing something a little off around you," I said, half joking, but with an edge of seriousness. He looked at me, the whites of his eyes hovering over dark circles below.
Yeah, you're probably right.
He let out a deep sigh. As I looked at him more closely, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was a dark, almost sticky energy clinging to him, like a cloud of black smoke that seemed as if only I could see it. It wasn't something I had ever encountered before, but I knew it wasn't good. Now I know that some people will scoff at this, but I've always felt as if I had the ability to sense the presence of the paranormal. I don't know if it's something I inherited, like hereditary. But I just somehow see things that others might not. "I bet that's why you're feeling so tired," I said, as I instinctively moved closer to him. I reached out and without thinking started to move my hands over him in an attempt to clear away that bad, weird energy from around him. It felt like trying to wipe away something that didn't want to budge, but after a few moments the air around him seemed to lighten. Yoichi stretched his shoulders and neck.
"Thanks, I feel a bit better now,"
he said, and then he smiled. Though the weariness in his eyes hadn't gone away, we sat down in his living room, and after a few quiet moments, Yoichi started to tell me about what had been going on. A little background before we push on with his story. Our store was located on a road that led to a cemetery, one that was famous for its view of the ocean. During Obon, the place gets packed with people, but for the rest of the year, it's pretty quiet. You could sort of recognize the regulars, as they would mostly be locals who stopped by to grab something on their way home from the store. And Yoichi had gotten to know most of them by sight, if not by name. His shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and during those late hours, customers were rare. He usually spent the night monitoring the security cameras from the small room behind the register. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, but it was fine. He said that he was used to it. He liked the quiet nights. But then one night, something strange happened. It was around 2 a.m. on a particularly quiet night when Yoichi noticed a man standing in front of the sandwiches and ready-made meals, trying to figure out what to buy. There was something off about the guy, though. Yoichi couldn't quite put his finger on it. "When did he come in?" Yoichi muttered to himself, frowning. He hadn't heard the chime that usually rang when someone entered the store. Everyone knows when you enter a convenience store that they have those chimes to alert the staff, but Yoichi swore that he hadn't heard a thing. He figured he must have missed it because he was tired. It was late, and after hours of staring at security monitors, it was easy to let your mind drift. He checked the register and he noticed that they were running low on change, so he decided to head to the back office to get more. The man was still browsing when he left the counter. He quickly exchanged the bills for coins, keeping an eye on the monitor the whole time, and then he made his way back to the register. Wait, where'd he go? Yoichi stopped in his tracks, staring at the empty space where the man had been standing just moments before. The man had vanished. For a moment, Yoichi thought he might have been a shoplifter. But the store's alarms would have gone off if he had tried to leave with something expensive without paying. There was no signs of any disturbance, no out-of-place items or dropped merchandise. It was as if the man had simply disappeared into thin air. Maybe the guy just decided not to buy anything and left quietly, Yoichi thought, trying to remain calm. He was alone in the store after all. At 6 a.m., the morning shift worker arrived, and Yoichi handed over his duties, changed out of his uniform, and headed home. The strange encounter lingered in his mind, but by the time he was heading home, he said he was too tired to give it too much thought. As soon as he got home, he crashed on his bed and fell asleep almost instantly. That's when this tiredness issue began for him. He was woken up a few hours later by a call from his manager. Still groggy, Yoichi answered the phone, expecting the usual check-in or maybe a request to cover another shift.
Did we have a power outage last night?
The manager asked. His voice had a note of irritation to it. Yoichi was confused and felt shattered. Huh? No? Why? The manager explained that some customers had called in that morning complaining about the sandwiches and the ready-made meals that they had bought the night before. They claimed that the food tasted off, some even saying that it was spoiled. This was unusual. One of his nightly duties was to stock the sandwiches and ready meals, and they seemed fresh when he received them that night. No, there was no power outage, Yoichi assured him. Thinking back to the night before, everything had been normal, or at least as normal as it could be.
Well, alright then,
the manager said, sounding a bit uncertain before hanging up. Yo. The guy you saw was a ghost, I blurted out, not really thinking about how it would sound. Yoichi's eyes widened in shock. Even after death, spirits still eat, I guess, but not like we do, I continued, trying to explain. They feed on the essence or scent of food. I've heard that when a spirit, especially one that starved to death, feeds on something, it can affect the taste or quality of the food. Yoichi stared at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. Considering where our store is, it wouldn't be that surprising if spirits wander in from time to time, I added, trying to sound calm, despite the unsettling nature of what I was saying.
It's rare for me, someone who's never been in touch with the supernatural, to have an experience like this,
he said quietly. You probably just ended up on the same wavelength as that spirit. Think about it like tuning a radio and finding a station in a sea of static, I offered, trying to reassure him. Even people who normally don't see ghosts can have a brush with them if the circumstances are just right. He sighed again, deeper this time. Apparently similar things happened for a few more nights before Yoichi finally decided to quit. The experiences were too frightening for him, and the sense of being watched by something unseen was too much to bear. I couldn't blame him, though. If I were in his shoes, I would have done the same. I wonder if the ghostly customer he saw in our store still comes in at around 2 a.m. I'm not looking to find out, though. I don't want to work the night shift. This is the story of the house I used to live in when I was elementary school age. It was in Naruse, a small part of Machida City, Tokyo. I'm 32 now, and I still can't forget the events that unfolded in that house. We moved to that house because my dad got transferred with his work. We had to uproot from our little town and move to the big city. I'll never forget move-in day. I remember we were all in the car, and as we got closer to our new home, I felt something strange. I'm not too sure how to word it, but it kind of felt like we had turned onto a bad road. It was like as my dad turned off onto the sloping hill that led to our new home, something was different. Like an uneasy feeling suddenly arrived inside of me, like we were heading towards danger. I've asked myself if it was all my imagination a few times, and I know it wasn't. Let me try to explain. We approached our new home, and, like I say, it was at the top of a steep hill. Our home was one of 4 new builds there. As we drove up, I felt as if something was watching me from the depths of the second house from the right. I didn't know it at the time, but that was going to be our new home. The shutters on the windows were closed, and of course there should have been no one in there watching and waiting, but somehow I felt something's presence before we arrived. There were 2 houses I got a weird vibe from. The one that something was watching from, and another one which was closest to the railway tracks. I didn't want to live in either of them, but I was doomed to, because the one where I felt a presence eyes upon me was the one we moved into. It's kind of hard to describe how I felt when I first entered the house. All I remember thinking was that the air felt dark. I'm not sure if that makes an awful lot of sense, but what it means to me is that the atmosphere felt heavy and oppressive. I felt uncomfortable in there, like something about the house was trying to reject me. I told my parents how I felt, but my words fell on deaf ears, and we moved in. It didn't take long for my mum to find work in our new area, and that meant that when she did work, I would find myself more often than not alone at home. It was a tough time because Mum wanted to fit in at her new place, and she tried to make as many social nights out as she could manage. Also, she stayed on late now and then at work. Of course, I missed our old life and I resented this new dynamic, but what can you do when you're a little kid, huh? Whenever I was home alone, I tried to spend as much time as I could outside of my home. I just didn't like being in there alone. When school was finished, I would play outside until my parents came back. The first strange incident that I can recall about our life in that house happened on the first Sunday after we moved in. It was lunchtime and we were all sat down watching the TV together as a family while eating lunch. Something fell into our garden with a huge thud. We all spun around to look at what it was. I was shocked to see that it was my school bag. I couldn't believe it. I usually dropped my school bag on my desk the moment I went upstairs, and that desk is on the other side of the room from the window, so it just made no sense to me as how my bag could suddenly end up in our garden. I ran upstairs to my bedroom, which was the room which faced the garden. I don't know why I did that. I must have been a little more fearless back then. I checked where I left my bag, and the room of course, but No one was up there. My family had all been in the living room, with me downstairs when the bag hit the ground, so I knew that there couldn't be anyone up there before I even got in there. Strangely enough, the windows were closed too in my bedroom. I cannot explain it. But that wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house. There were lots more than that. One other night, I was sleeping soundly in my bed, and I woke up to hear heavy footsteps downstairs on the hardwood floor. I listened closely in my half-asleep state, and then I checked the time. I thought I might have been late for school or something, but it was the middle of the night. Who would be down there at like 3 a.m., I wondered. Then suddenly the footsteps seemed to be climbing the stairs. They were so loud they sounded like someone was rushing up the stairs. The footsteps stopped at my door for a second or two. I lay there in bed freaking out, and then they started up again. They went back downstairs, and finally, out of earshot. As I was young, I was too scared to open the door and go check it out. Little did I know that this wasn't going to be the last time that I would hear those footsteps. They came and went as they pleased, and that was usually at nighttime. I thought I was hearing things at one point because no one else in the house seemed to react to the footsteps. One night while it was happening, my bedroom door flew open and I screamed. Fortunately, it was only my dad out there, and he came into my room and he looked really concerned. He asked me, "Has someone been coming into your room?" I was all like, "No, what are you talking about?" My dad then said,
I thought I heard some footsteps on the roof. I was wondering if someone was trying to get in. Maybe they climbed a tree or something else and was looking for an open window.
Well, that terrified me. I got out of bed and I went with my dad to the window. We tried our best to see if anyone was out there in the yard, but we couldn't see anyone. We did notice that our neighbor had his light on and he was looking outside as well. I think it was again about 3 a.m. when this happened. Our neighbor shouted out that he thought he saw someone on our roof. That really scared me. Why would someone want to go up there in the middle of the night? That neighbor of ours was the one who was living in the house that was closest to the railway tracks. That was one of the houses that creeped me out too. Maybe he was going through some stuff. I mean, he was up and ready at 3 a.m. Unfortunately, we had little other options than to go back to sleep that night. So that's what we did. When I got up in the morning, I found my dad outside searching the premises. I went outside to join him, and I noticed that there were lots of footprints out there. It had rained the night before, so the grass was fairly damp, and we could make out foot indentations all over the garden. The strangest thing about it all was the fact that these were bare footprints that we were seeing. We weren't looking at shoe prints. Someone was running around out there, barefoot. It just didn't make sense. We were all very shaken up, and every night my dad would pace around the house with a torch and double and even triple check the doors and windows were locked at night. Things quietened down for about 3 or 4 days, but then we heard a terrifying noise coming from outside one night. It sounded like someone was climbing up the drainage pipe. My dad was straight out there to go and check it with his flashlight. He shone it at the drainage pipe, and all he could see were muddy footprints and handprints on it. It was the first time in my life that I saw my parents scared. It was unnerving, because ever since I was a little boy, they were the ones who had protected me and told me not to worry or be scared, and there they were, terrified. This was the point where my parents called the police. Some might say it was a little late at that point, and I tend to agree. I think we could have called them a little sooner. The police didn't help too much though. They said that they would patrol the area a little more. This all happened during the first month that we lived there. Everyone was on edge after the police call. And it was around that 1 month period that I started to notice a change in my dad. It was like everything changed. He even looked somehow different. The facial expressions he would make looked so alien to me. It was like he was acting. That was nothing compared to how drastic the change in his behavior was. He started becoming abusive to my mother. I get the chills when I think back to how my father looked back then. It sounds crazy, but he looked like he was a completely different person. We moved out of that house, my mother and I, and eventually my father did too. Once he was away from that place, he reverted back to his usual self. It makes me wonder though, was something there? It seems strange because the house was brand new, but it felt like something was wrong with it. Like it was an accident property or something. I really don't know, but I feel like that place gave off bad energy. When I got older, I decided to try and do a little digging. There were no accidents in that property because it was new, but there were some fatal events that happened on the slope that led up to the house, and some others in the surrounding area. It seems like the slope had been the site of a high number of accidents. There had been deaths out there. In the surrounding neighborhoods, something terrible happened. Someone set themselves on fire. Also, due to the fact that we lived close to a railway track, there were a few cases where people took their own lives on the railway crossings. It just felt like it was the site of so much misery. In fact, I went back to see the house for the first time in 20 years last week. The town had changed into a well-developed area. It was almost unrecognizable. The fishing pond and the vacant lot that I frequented when I was young were gone. But the house we lived in at the top of the slope, it was still there. 2 of the 4 houses had been rebuilt, but the 2 that creeped me out, my neighbor's house near the train tracks and of course the house that we lived in, they were still standing. It was as if time stood still. The houses looked the same as they did 20 years ago. New houses had been built close by, but they remained like a gloomy reminder of our horrible short stay in that town. I'm glad we left. I truly am. Hi, Jay here. I liked this story because it reminded me of the concept of psychogeography. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's basically the study of how places make us feel and behave. It makes me wonder if there are places where terrible things have happened in the past that become beacons for more terrible things to happen. When I was a child, I used to play out in the woods often. What child didn't? I found a shrine out in these woods one time, and after I discovered it, I used to go out there and play, often. This small shrine was at the foot of a mountain. It was roughly about 1 kilometer, or just over half a mile from my home. I loved it there because it was almost always void of people. I used to call it the deserted shrine. It was like it was my own little special spot. The trees and weeds grew thick by the side of the shrine. Come to think of it, the shrine might have been derelict. I didn't notice the first couple of times that I played there, but there was a tree nearby. From one of the great boughs of that tree dangled a gnarled and worn rope. Someone had tied this rope there, and it had created a perfect kind of swinging point. I loved it from the moment I laid eyes on it. I mean, It didn't have a seat like a traditional rope swing, but if you took a run up and jumped and grabbed it, then you would be swinging just like Tarzan, from vine to vine, you know? I felt like a character in a movie when I was playing out there. It was just the best. It was a little high up, but if you ran and jumped high enough, you could get it. One lame thing about the deserted shrine was the fact that a couple of neighbor kids spotted me swinging there, and then it became a little bit more active. I can't remember, I might have bragged about it to one of my close friends or something, but yeah, it wasn't secluded anymore. One day I went to the shrine by myself, a little later than usual. I can't remember why I went alone or why I wanted to go alone. Maybe I just wanted to feel like the shrine and the swing were mine again. I walked the short distance to the shrine from my home. I remember it was still kind of bright out, even though it was really late. It was summer. As I came up on the shrine grounds, I was relieved to see that there were no shadows or silhouettes nearby, and that meant that the shrine and the rope swing were mine and mine alone for the evening. I approached the rope swing through the woods, as usual, and that was when I first saw it. It was the strangest sight I've ever seen. It was a human face. There was this strangely pale human face right in front of the rope swing. Let me explain. Imagine, for a second, you're lying on your back in a swimming pool, with just your face above the water. That's how it looked. There was an incredibly pale face emerging from the dirt beneath the swing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I'm shocked that I didn't run. Shocked that I didn't scream too. I don't know why, but I wasn't frightened. I think, at that point, I was just trying to figure out what I was looking at. I kind of thought for a second or two that it could have been a mask or something, but I second-guessed it. If it was a discarded mask laying on the ground, it just looked too real. It looked human. The features were so defined. They appeared so lifelike. As I approached, I realized that the pale face belonged to a woman. Quite a beautiful woman, actually. Her eyes were staring up at the sky, as if in study of the stars in the heavens. I was conflicted. I had a strong desire to get closer and take a proper look, but I also had a strong desire to turn and sprint in the opposite direction. I didn't know which move to make, but then the face that was stargazing from the dirt decided for me. Its eyes shifted their focus on me. The woman's face in the ground was staring at me. It was aware of my presence. Before I knew it, I was running away, and I never went back to the deserted shrine after that. No matter how many times my friends asked me to. I couldn't forget what I saw. It was something that my mind couldn't comprehend. I thought about what I saw for a number of years, and sometimes I wonder if a body was buried beneath that rope. And the rope wasn't used as a swing at all. Perhaps it had a different use. Perhaps I saw some kind of glimpse into a past crime. On the other hand, I questioned my memory. I wonder if what I was looking at was nothing more than a good movie prop or prank. But then I asked myself, why would someone want to do that? I come from a town out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, city kids would have been going to the mall at that age, and I was playing at a deserted shrine. It doesn't make sense. Pranks, like the movies, just don't seem all that common here, you know. Plus, if they wanted to go all out for that prank, then it would be wasted because I was the only one who probably stumbled across that woman's face buried in the dirt. Makes no sense to me at all. Either way, to lay in wait to prank one kid isn't a heavy return on the effort involved, right? I just can't stop thinking about it. That face lying there beneath the rope, just lying in wait for something. The scary beauty of it peacefully gazing up into the sky, and then suddenly focusing its gaze on me when it was alerted to my presence. Something happened out there, I think. I said I wouldn't go back, but that was kind of a lie. I actually went back recently. The rope still hangs there from the tree. It's worn and sagging to the ground. It looks like no one's been playing there for a while. I should maybe get someone out there to investigate it or something. Sorry, it's just dawned on me I sound probably completely mad. This is a story that has been passed by word of mouth through members of the Japanese military. I really like this one. It's a story of romance between a local woman and a soldier. The soldier was on duty, watching over a warehouse. He was on the night shift, and that's when they first met. She took a risk to approach the soldier on duty because she thought he was handsome, and it didn't take long before they quickly got to know one another. They hit it off right away, and soon enough they were arranging rendezvous regularly. They would meet in secret on the soldier's night shift down by the warehouse. He knew it was wrong because he was supposed to be on guard, but he couldn't resist. Before long, they were both infatuated with one another, so every time the soldier asked to meet the local woman, she quickly and happily agreed. They continued on in this fashion, meeting after dark until one night the soldier developed a high fever and he couldn't meet her. He couldn't get up out of bed, he was so sick. Naturally, it meant that another soldier was taking over his night shift duties. That day it rained steadily, but the rain turned heavy at night. Out of the dark, a figure wrapped in a raincoat approached the replacement soldier. "Who goes there?" shouted the replacement. The local woman smiled, thinking her lover was joking with her, and she steadily approached the warehouse. "Who goes there?" shouted the replacement. The woman approached closer, smiling, thinking of being with her lover. "Who goes there?" shouted the replacement as he aimed his gun at her. The rule at the time in the army was, if there was no response after 3 attempts to identify, then the soldier had the right to shoot on sight. The soldier did not hesitate. He took aim and fired at the woman. An innocent woman was executed, and what's worse is that after the soldier learned the fate of his lover, he decided to end things on his own terms as well, perhaps because he fell into a deep state of despair. Nowadays, a local legend states that an apparition can be seen in front of the warehouse in an old-style military uniform. They say that the soldier looks forlorn and can only be spotted when it rains heavily. Perhaps he stands there waiting for his rendezvousing lover, tethered to this world, waiting for her, yet knowing she'll never come. This story is well known in the army, apparently. I read it in a book that was a compilation of ghost stories from all over Japan in a university library. It also described the place, which seems to be the location where it happened. According to the book, it happened in Kawaga, Shikoku, and the soldier was in the ranks of the Zentsuji army, which were headquartered in Kawaga from 1896 to 1945. The warehouse building is still in use as a training facility for the Japanese Self-Defense Force and the students of Shikoku Gakuin University. It makes sense because I've come across stories about a sad soldier being sighted on a rainy night in the same area, but I haven't ever really been able to place the meaning behind it. As you can imagine, I was quite happy to find this story. Some go out on rainy nights in search of the heartbroken soldier. Perhaps he still appears from time to time on nights where it rains heavily. There was this eerie experience I had one autumn night that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It all started one night when I was out driving around with a friend. We didn't have a particular destination in mind, just cruising through the back roads of our prefecture, enjoying the cool night air. After a while, I suddenly felt the urgent need to use the bathroom, so we decided to stop at a nearby park. We pulled into the parking lot, and as I got out of the car, I glanced at my watch. It was around 3 a.m. that dead of night hour where the world feels eerily quiet. My friend, who's always been a bit jumpy, hesitated and asked,
"Should we go somewhere else?"
but I was too desperate to wait. There wasn't another restroom in sight, so despite my friend's protests, I dragged her along with me towards the park's restroom. The park was built on the ruins of an old castle and was usually bustling during the day, especially in spring when the Cherry Blossom Festival brought crowds of people, but at this hour it was deserted. The park was dimly lit by a few streetlights, and the moon was almost full, making it bright enough to see without too much trouble. The combination of the streetlights and the moonlight made the park look almost serene, but there was a stillness in the air, like an uncomfortable pause. There was just something that made you feel a little apprehensive. After finishing up in the bathroom, I felt like stretching my legs a little bit. It had been a while since I last visited this park, so I suggested that we take a quick stroll around while it was quiet before heading back. My friend, who's not a fan of anything remotely spooky, was understandably reluctant, but knowing how much I love exploring places, especially at night, she begrudgingly agreed. I thought that it would be pretty cool to be in the ruins alone. Just us girls. It made me feel kind of brave. The park had this gravel path lined with cherry blossom trees, which were beautiful in the spring, but now, in the autumn, the trees looked bare and kind of depressed. The path led to a flower garden that was divided into 4 sections. In the middle of the garden there was a small pavilion, a simple structure with no walls, just a roof and a couple of benches underneath. As we walked closer to the garden, my friend suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. I turned around, wondering if she had tripped over something, but before I could ask, she pointed towards the pavilion, her voice trembling as she whispered,
"There's something there. Look."
I squinted in the direction that she was pointing in, my eyes struggling to adjust to the shadows under the pavilion's roof. It took a moment, but then I saw it too. A dark, shadowy figure slumped on the bench. I'll admit it, my heart skipped a beat. My friend was practically shaking, but somehow seeing her so panicked helped me keep my cool. I kept staring at the figure, trying to make out what it was. It was too dark to see clearly, but something about the shape of it didn't feel right. After what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a minute or two, I realized what it was. The shadowy figure wasn't a ghost or a cryptid or anything supernatural. It was just a homeless person, probably using the pavilion as a makeshift shelter for the night. I noticed a couple of bags and some old shoes tucked in under the bench, confirming my guess. I tried to calm my friend down. I whispered, "Let's go. It's just someone sleeping there. No need to freak out." We quickly backed away, careful not to make any noise, and we headed back the way we came. My friend, still shaken, kept asking,
"What was that? Did you see that?"
"It's just a homeless guy," I reassured her, "probably sleeping there for the night." My friend seemed a bit relieved, but I knew she was still on the edge. Honestly, at that hour, it was more concerning to run into a stranger in a deserted park than to see a ghost. We started talking about random stuff to lighten the mood as we made our way back along the gravel path. The park was quiet, the only sounds being our footsteps crunching on the gravel and our low voices. But after a few minutes, both of us suddenly stopped and turned around at the same time. We had heard something, a sound that wasn't our own. It was footsteps, but not the slow, steady kind. these sounded like someone was running, coming from somewhere behind us. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just our nerves playing tricks on us. But the sound was real and getting louder, like something or someone was coming towards us fast. My friend grabbed my hand. I knew she had heard it too. The sound wasn't just footsteps, it was almost like the quick, erratic rhythm of something with more than two legs. Like an animal, maybe. But it didn't quite sound like a dog either. There was something unnatural about it. I tried to tell myself it was someone walking their dog late at night, but the closer the sound got, the more uneasy I felt. We kept walking, trying to act normal, but every few seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder. Each time I did, the footsteps would stop, and there'd be nothing there. No person, no dog, no animal, no sign of anything. Just the eerie, empty path behind us. By now we were walking faster, almost at a jog, heading straight for the car. But the footsteps didn't slow down. They seemed to be keeping pace with us, closing in with every step. Finally, just as it felt like the sound was right behind us, I spun around, pulling my friend behind me, ready to face whatever was there. But there was nothing. Just empty space and the stillness of the park. The footsteps had stopped as suddenly as they had started, disappearing into the silence of the night. My friend was freaking out, saying,
"Something just passed right by me. I felt it. It brushed against my arm."
I felt it too. A cold shiver running down my left side, like something had walked right through me. I have no idea what that was. We didn't waste any more time. We bolted back to the car, not daring to look back again. Whatever it was, whether it was our imagination or something more, I wasn't about to stick around and find out. Even now, when I think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that something really was there, something that we couldn't see. And I'll tell you one thing, I'm not keen on going back to that park anytime soon. When I was a university student, I landed a job working in a coffee house. It was only part-time, so I was able to balance it out well with my studies. It gave me a good independent feeling. It felt good knowing that I was supporting myself and gaining some experience. This coffee house, a cozy little place nestled in a quiet neighborhood, attracted a mix of students, professionals, and regular customers. I enjoyed the hustle and bustle of the cafe, and to my complete surprise, I actually loved the aspect of customer service. I enjoyed getting the chance to interact with a variety of people. From the start, I was determined to work hard and make an impact. I made it a point to greet every customer with a warm smile, hoping to brighten their day, even if just a little. This small gesture seemed to resonate with many of our patrons, who appreciated my friendly approach. My efforts didn't go unnoticed either. The full-time staff and my fellow part-time employees often complimented me, saying, "God, you're always so cheerful." These words of encouragement boosted my confidence and made each day and each shift seem to fly by. Among the coffee house's patrons was a regular customer who stood out to me. He came in almost every day, usually at the same time, and ordered the same thing. My colleagues often joked, "He's definitely here to see you, eh?" I'm using A as a placeholder for my name, which I laughed off initially. But I couldn't help but notice that his gaze often lingered for longer that was comfortable. Sometimes it's natural to catch eyes with someone, but it was happening more than normal. It was beginning to seem like he was staring at me. Over a short period of time, I figured out that he was timing his visits to coincide with my shifts, making sure to sit where he had a clear view of the counter where I was working. Despite these observations, I chose to remain professional and continued to treat him like any other customer. I really didn't know what other options I had. One day, while I was busy behind the counter, this regular customer approached me and handed me a small piece of paper. It looked like it had been torn out of a notebook. Taken aback but not wanting to make a scene, I accepted the note and slipped it into my pocket, thinking I would take a look at it later. When I finally had a moment to myself, I unfolded the scrap piece of paper, and I was shocked to see that written on it was an address and a phone number. The casualness of this note contrasted sharply with the seriousness of this new situation for me. It was unsettling, to say the least. Thinking back on it now, knowing what I know, I think stomach churning would be a more accurate turn of phrase to describe the situation as. I was shocked. I couldn't think of a thing to say about it, so I decided to pretend that nothing had happened. I didn't acknowledge the note, hoping that by not reacting, I would discourage any further advances. However, about a week later, the same regular customer returned, once again, handing me a note. As he was a customer, I kind of felt obliged to take it. Once again, I pocketed the note until I had a private moment to check it. By the way, I realized how naive I was being. This time my hands shook as I unfurled the note. I gasped when I found my own address and apartment number scrawled on it. Beneath the address was a message asking, "If you don't want to come to my place, then maybe I should come and meet you here." I had never shared my address with anyone outside of my trusted friends and family, making this intrusion feel deeply personal and invasive. The realization that he had somehow obtained this information really frightened me. Nevertheless, I convinced myself that if I just ignored him, then he might just give up and leave me alone. I didn't want to escalate the situation by reacting overtly. I was 19 years old and this guy was 35? I wasn't interested at all, even if I looked at him objectively. I just thought that he would get it, get that I wasn't interested in him and move on. But just 2 days later, he returned, this time with an envelope. Inside there was a photograph of me, taken without my knowledge or consent outside my apartment building. On the back, a chilling message read, "I'll come to your house tomorrow, so please wait for me." The situation had escalated from unsettling to outright terrifying. The photograph indicated that he was watching me outside of work, violating my personal space and sense of safety. Feeling deeply disturbed and unsafe, I threw away the photo immediately. I realized that this was not something that I could handle alone, and decided to ask for help. I confided in a close friend, explaining everything in detail, and I ended up staying over at their place for a while, just to avoid being alone. I didn't want to go back to work, because the idea alone of returning to work became a source of anxiety. The coffee shop, once a source of happiness for me, now felt like a potential trap where that man could appear at any moment. I shared my concerns with my co-workers, who were supportive and promised to be vigilant for me. They assured me that they would keep an eye out for this guy and prevent any direct contact between him and me. Although their support was comforting, it did little to alleviate the fear that had taken root in my mind. 3 days crawled by. I was on the edge during each of those shifts, but for some reason my regular customer, turned stalker, didn't show up. But on that 3rd day, things changed. I went to the back of the coffee house to take out the trash, a routine job that I had done hundreds of times before. However, this time was different. As I opened the door, I saw him standing there, waiting for me. The sight of him left me frozen in place, my mind racing, my body unable to move. He was holding something that looked like a knife. I couldn't see it clearly. Part of it was hidden in his sleeve. Then, with a voice that carried a mix of confusion and anger, he asked, "Why are you ignoring me?" He hadn't gone away. He was just lying in wait for me. In a state of panic, I blurted out, "I'm sorry, but I like someone else." It was a lie. A desperate attempt to defuse the situation and create some distance. His response was chilling. "Then break up with him and be with me. I promise I'll take good care of you," he said. His tone, insistent, unsettling, and emotionless. His words were not a request, but a demand, as if my feelings or choices were irrelevant. I continued to apologize, unsure of what else to do. The reality of the knife in his hand made every word feel like it could be my last. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. "If that's how it is, then maybe I'll just do what I want." And he slowly revealed the knife he had hidden in his sleeve. He started playing with it, moving it from hand to hand. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to scream or call for help. At that crucial moment, a male staff member came out from behind, his voice booming. "What do you think you're doing?" My regular customer, startled and possibly realizing the presence of a potential witness, ran, and he ran off fast. The staff member quickly called the police, and I gave a detailed account of the events, from the notes to the photograph, right up until the knife. The police took the situation seriously and assured me that they would look into the matter and try to locate the man. The incident had shaken me to my core, feeling unsafe and unable to continue working at a place that I had once felt secure. I made the difficult decision to quit my job. I moved to a new neighborhood and changed my phone number, trying to erase any trace that could lead him back to me. The entire ordeal left me with some deep-rooted trauma. The aspects of my first job, the customer service and being in the public, are now things that gives me anxiety. The thought of interacting with strangers, I'm sorry to say, especially men, filled me with dread, and even being in public spaces nowadays stresses me out. It's taken a long time, many years, and a lot of support to start overcoming my fear of men. And while I now live a relatively normal life, I can't really say that I've fully recovered. This experience has left a dark mark on my psyche. Whenever I hear the news about a violent stalker or a crime similar, a shiver runs down my spine, thinking of how things could have turned out for me. The memory of this serves as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in seemingly mundane interactions and the importance of taking threats seriously, no matter how innocuous they may initially seem. I first noticed when my girlfriend came over to help clean my apartment. Now, I'll admit, I'm not exactly the neatest person. My small, cramped apartment was practically a minefield of trash bags, random items, and all sorts of clutter. It wasn't like one of those crazy hoarder houses you see on TV or anything, but it was definitely chaotic. There were clear paths to walk. My chair and TV were free from mess. I did clean every now and then, but let's face it, when you're living alone, it's easy to let things slide. My girlfriend, she didn't like the state of my apartment, and she would often use it as an excuse not to come and see me. I would always have to go to hers. She would occasionally come over and help me out with the mess. She'd take one look at the place, shake her head, and then start tidying up. I'd feel a bit guilty, so I'd pitch in, even if I wasn't great at it. We'd usually get the place looking halfway decent by the time we were done. The day that this experience took place was no different. She showed me. She showed up and immediately started cleaning. I joined in, picking up books and random knickknacks, trying to put things where they belonged. We were working on opposite sides of the room. Then she suddenly stopped and called out to me.
Hey, come look at this.
I walked over to where she was standing, and she was pointing at an outlet hidden behind a pile of old magazines and videotapes. Yeah, this happened a while ago. From one of the sockets, a long strand of hair was dangling down. Not just any hair. This was long, dark, human hair.
Whose hair is this?
She asked, her eyes narrowing on me. She knew all my friends were guys, and I've always kept my hair short. Her hair wasn't this long either. I was just as confused as she was, so naturally I began to feel hot under the collar. I didn't have an explanation. I could see she was starting to get suspicious, so I reached out and carefully pulled the hair from the outlet. As I tugged on it, I felt something weird. There was some resistance. Do you know what I mean? The strand of hair went taut, and then there was sort of a snap, like when you pull a hair straight out of someone's scalp. The long strand fell to the hardwood floor, landing on the freshly cleaned surface, and swaying slightly in the breeze. It stood out like a sore thumb. I just couldn't figure it out. Why is this happening? Curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to peer into the outlet. All I saw was darkness. Nothing unusual, just a black emptiness inside. I do feel as if there was some empty space beyond the two pin sockets in the wall that stared back at me. I tried not to think of it much after that. My girlfriend and I finished cleaning, and later that night, we went out for karaoke. We had a few drinks, sang some terrible songs, parted ways. As it was a Sunday night, and by the time I got home, I was too exhausted to do anything but collapse in bed. The next morning I was running late as usual. I jumped out of bed, threw on some clothes, and grabbed my bag. As I was rushing to leave, something caught my eye. The outlet. I froze. There it was again, a long strand of hair, just like the one from the day before, hanging limply from the same socket. A black strand of hair, obvious on the hardwood floor. I was a little more than freaked out. I had definitely pulled that hair out of the socket yesterday, so why was it back? I hurried over, yanked it out, feeling that same weird tension, and then ultimately, the unsettling snap. I kind of shuddered at that sensation, so I did something impulsive. I grabbed an old CD player, a boombox, that I hadn't used in ages, and I plugged it into the outlet. I figured if something was weird about that socket, then maybe covering it up would help me forget about it. I tossed the strand of hair out the window and watched as it caught the wind, and then I rushed out of the door. For the next few weeks, life returned to normal. I got busy with work, and before I knew it, the apartment was back to its usual state of clutter. I started stacking manga next to my bed, and the bin was overrunning with trash. Every now and then, I'd think about that outlet, but with something plugged into the output, I managed to push it to the back of my mind. Then, about a month later, something happened that still gives me the chills. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. Groggy and half asleep, I fumbled for the light switch and squinted around the room. The noise was coming from the boombox, which was weird because I hadn't touched it in weeks. The sound was this low, grinding noise, like the radio was trying to play something, but couldn't quite manage it. I got up and walked over to it, noticed that the stacks of manga had been toppled over, scattered around the room. It didn't make any sense. There's no way the radio was loud enough to knock them over. This weird grinding noise was still ongoing, and it was seriously starting to creep me out. I reached for the power button, and that's when I noticed that the boombox was already shut off. I stared at it for a moment, my hand hovering over the switch. How could it be making noise if it was turned off? Was it broken? I grabbed at it with both hands, intending to move it, and that's when I felt it, again, that same horrible sensation. The cord was tangled in something, a thick mass of hair, tightly wrapped around it like vines. My heart started racing as I traced the hair back to the outlet. There, where it was spilling out of the socket. This wasn't just a strand this time, this was a full-on clump of long, dark, dirty-looking hair, and it was pouring out the socket and wrapping around the boombox's cord. I yanked it away from the wall socket hard without thinking. Snap. The feeling of 1,000 hairs being ripped out from someplace vibrated through my hands. At that exact moment, a piercing scream echoed around the room. It was so loud and so full of pain that I nearly dropped the boombox. The hair unraveled from its cord, fell to the floor, and that's when I saw it. Blood. Thick, dark blood was oozing from the socket, pooling on the floor beneath it. I let out a scream, stumbling back, crashing into the bed. The last thing I remember was the room spinning as I hit the floor. When I came to, I rushed to my feet, cleaned up as best I could. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer after that. I needed to get out, and fast. I packed a bag, grabbing my essentials, and I left the apartment, barely looking back. But just as I was about to walk out of the door, something made me glance over my shoulder, towards the outlet, one last time. A single strand of hair was hanging from the socket again. But it wasn't just dangling lifelessly like before. It was moving, slowly, almost deliberately, swaying back and forth, like it was reaching for something. No, not something, someone. It moved with an unnatural fluid grace, like it was alive.
Don't leave me. Stay.
The voice was coming from the outlet, from inside the outlet. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted out of the door, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building, my chest burning and my legs trembling from exhaustion. I kept going, not daring to look back, not daring to slow down, until I was far, far away. I never went back to that apartment. I couldn't. I found a new place and threw away anything that had come from that room. I tried to forget what happened, but the memory has always haunted me. Sometimes late at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I could hear that voice again, whispering from the darkness, begging me to come back. The sound of static would fill my ears, and I swear I could feel something brushing against my skin. Soft, like hair. But the worst part? Every now and then I'd find a long strand of hair on my pillow, or caught in my clothes, even though I've kept my hair short ever since that night. It's stupid, but I think whatever was in that outlet is waiting for me, It's patient, and it's hungry. One day, it might find a way to reach me again. My girlfriend thought I was crazy, and she didn't stay around too long after that. As for me, I like things to be clean these days. Clean and pure. One night last autumn, I was working late at the office on a project. I ended up staying later than I wanted, and I missed my train home. It couldn't be helped. I would have to get a taxi home. I was really tired, and the taxi driver was really energetic. He was incredibly talkative. I didn't like it to begin with, but in the end, I joined in with him and had a chat. It was quite nice. The route the driver took went through a mountain pass. It was all perfectly normal. I lived out in the sticks. It was dark on those mountain roads. I was starting to feel sleepy. There was a dense forest to the left-hand side. It was so empty out there. You know, I don't think I saw another car out driving that night. The driver went a little quiet, and I wondered what the problem was. He had been so talkative before. It looked like something was on his mind. I caught him quickly glimpsing at me in the rear-view mirror, and I started to get a little nervous. It was as if a switch had been flipped. I was mentally reviewing our conversation and trying to find out if I had said something to upset the taxi driver. I caught another glimpse of my driver's face when he glanced at me in the rear-view mirror again. He looked worried, like a completely different person. So I decided to break the silence. "Hey, is everything okay?" "Hey, it's nothing really, but could you just do me a favor? Just from now on, could you not look out the window, okay? Just really don't do it. Thanks." I was so shocked by his change in behavior that all I could reply was, "Okay." We continued on our journey, and silence had resumed again. I sat there puzzled for a while, but I did as he asked. I didn't look out of the window. I couldn't imagine for what reason it would be necessary, though. A few moments passed, and I got a little bored, or maybe frustrated, with the fact that I couldn't do what I wanted. So I asked the driver, "Hey, why shouldn't I look out the window, pal?" He didn't reply. He just kept looking straight ahead. Naturally, I started to feel a little nervous again. We were still driving alongside that deep and dense forest, and this guy was acting strangely. I didn't like it. We came to a set of traffic lights, and I heard some voice beginning to yell from the side of the car. It was coming from the other side of the window that I was told not to look out of. I couldn't take not looking out of the window anymore, so I ignored the driver's request and I looked out there. A middle-aged man was shambling his way over to the taxi. He looked exhausted but very angry at the same time. He cupped his dirty-looking hands to the glass and then he peered in at me. It looked like he studied my face very carefully. I was taken aback. I just wanted to get out of there, but the traffic light was a solid red moon in the dark. I looked back at the stranger staring at me. And then he slammed his hand on the glass and shouted, "It wasn't you." And with that he turned away to leave. Just as the traffic light changed color, and we pulled away. I asked the taxi driver what the hell that was all about, and he said, "See, this is why I always tell people not to look at that guy. He's out here all the time. He just stands there holding up traffic, pressing that crossing button whenever he hears a car coming. I guess he's gotten pretty good at it, since he always stops me when I come through here." I was kind of shocked. I mean, that didn't really tell me anything. I wanted to know why he knew that was going to happen, so I asked. I heard from someone who apparently lives near the guy that the reason he does that is because his wife was killed in a hit-and-run accident. They were out on a late-night stroll, and he actually got a good look at the guy who hit her. Apparently, he got out of the car for a couple of seconds as if he was trying to decide whether or not to help. But then he fled. That's when that old man got a good look at him. He gave the police a description of the car and the driver, but to this day, he's still at large. I never found him, so the old man has taken up the task. He waits there most nights trying to catch a glimpse of the guy who killed his wife and split. I guess you kind of get why he said, "It wasn't you." Now, right? I told you not to look his way because, I don't know, I didn't want him to spook you out, but I guess he did. That guy was scary, but overall I feel really bad for him. I hope one day they do catch the hit-and-run driver, so he can rest easy. To think he stands there alone most nights, just praying he'll find the culprit, makes my heart feel heavy.